down those cards.
Fortune teller!
Cards mean different things at different times.
Do you know anything about tarot cards?
Oh, a crystal ball.
Gather round, children.
Listen to the mystic.
Journey.
Podcast.
I'm no mystic.
Welcome to the Mystic Fool's Journey podcast. I'm Anna, and this is Ruth. Howdy. This is an occult history podcast, and today we're taking a deep dive into familiars. So let's dive on in.
So today we're going to be talking about familiars, and I think we're all familiar with the concept of familiars.
Hey.
I mean, we've all seen Harry Potter. So we're going to dive into the history and origins of familiars, and we'll dive into their evolution, significance, and the rich tapestry of beliefs and practices surrounding them. So we can find the concept of divine, sacred, or spiritual connection to animals in basically every culture and ancient civilization. Native Americans have a long history of associating animals with wisdom and guidance. Shamans often believed that they could communicate with animals who could provide insight and assistance in their spiritual quests. And similar uses can be found in Chinese Taoism and ancient Egypt. I feel like we should take a shot every time we find origins of something we talk about in ancient Egypt.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's got everything. It's probably got at least a little bit of everything in it.
Truly. And ancient Egypt is actually the first place where we can find recorded instances of familiars. Egyptians believed that animals possess a spiritual connection to the divine and often kept animals like birds and cats as companions and protectors. We could really dive into these different cultures and the nuances in each of their unique relationship with animals, but I think it'd probably be more fun for us if we focus on the European folklore of familiars. In the olden days of European folklore, like back in medieval and early modern times, folks had this concept of familiars. And according to the records from back then, people who claimed to have met these familiar spirits said that they could take on all sorts of shapes.
Yeah, and more specifically, a lot of the records we have around familiars come from, unfortunately, the Scottish and English witch trials held during the 16th and 17th centuries. And, it's good to keep in mind that these trials, like others throughout history, were the state's way of outlawing or punishing people for practicing indigenous traditions. So, the classic tale of the dominant political and religious system wanting to get rid of anything that's different or allows people to question their system. That little chestnut.
Yeah, it's true. We've talked a couple of times about doing an episode on witch trials and some of the lesser known witch trials. But so in this episode, we'll definitely touch on those topics. I was kind of bummed when I found out that it was so rooted in the witch trials. I was hoping we'd have some sort of a funner, maybe a lore-y folk tale of all these of familiars and how they came into the how we know them today. But it is just witch trials, and we'll get into that later on. But it was kind of a bummer for me.
Yeah, it's a bummer. But before we get to that part, what did familiars appear as? Because we always think of cats.
Yeah, so sometimes they would appear as animals, and other times they'd go all human or humanoid on you. Folks described them as being really clear and vivid, like they were living, breathing creatures with color, movement, and even sound. It was pretty rare that they'd be apparitions or anything like that, very much 3D things. And it's quite the contrast to those smoky, shapeless ghosts that people usually talk about. The concept of familiars, as we commonly understand them today, became prominent during the witch hunts and trials of medieval Europe. Familiars are often associated with witches and seen as their supernatural accomplices. These animal companions were believed to be given to witches by the devil himself in exchange for loyalty. That's a fair trade.
Yeah, I guess.
Now, when familiars were hanging out with witches, things got a little bit spooky. They were often seen as troublemakers, up to no good. But when they were on the clock with cunning folk, it was a whole different story. People thought that they were pretty nice, and even things weren't always crystal clear in either case. So if they were with witches, they'd often get labeled as demons, and that's definitely not a friendly title. But when they teamed up with nicer people, they were more like fairies, little magical creatures from folklore. Fairies were huge back in medieval times.
They were. I feel like there should be another episode we do on fair folk and fairies, because they also weren't great. Fairies
not at all.
Has some dark history to them, so it's interesting that when they teamed up with cunning folk, fairies were actually like better than demons somehow because they've got some feisty history. That's a different episode. But yeah, we'll definitely get there. I definitely think I could see where this is headed. People who were not practitioners of Europe's folk magic loved to label anything that wasn't Christian as demonic, of course. And for magic practitioners of the time, familiars weren't necessarily evil demons. They were actually more just like spiritual or supernatural entities. And I learned about this because I had to look up cunning folk because I hadn't heard that as a phrase used in that way. Like they were different from witches. Like in my head, I was like, oh, they're the same. But back then, they were not. Society actually made a distinction between witches and cunning folk. So cunning folk were usually folk healers or wise men, wise women, conjurers, and they usually specialized in helpful folk magic, folk medicine, and divination. So they were good. They were beneficial to society, if you will. So like as a concept, cunning folk, even though they have different names, they existed across Scandinavia, Britain, Germany, Italy, Russia, Ireland. Obviously, they had different names depending on what culture we look at, but them as a concept existed across this area. So they practiced that beneficial magic, and oftentimes I actually found out some of them were Christian. Like it was very common that they were Christian, but they were also practicing this magic. While witches were exclusively seen as malevolent, and they only practiced like harmful magic, curses, and were in league with the devil. And when I was reading about what cunning folk did, in addition to medicine and healing, they were also petitioned to help remove curses from witches. So they were actively like set against witches of the time.
Isn't that so funny? It's so funny. And I feel like this is truly the biggest loss of them all, how siloed into Christianity we've gotten in the modern day. Like, it's pretty fun that there are these different versions of Christianity out there and different jobs within Christianity. I think one very good example of cunning folk, if anybody here is familiar, is Rasputin.
Oh.
Yeah, so he was a magic practitioner in, like, the Russian, royalty sort of guys, and he was in charge of, like, healing their kids and that sort of thing. And he was also had Megan Christian or Catholic beliefs, so it's kind of, that's a good comparison. When you think of cunning folk, think of Rasputin, before he got weird.
before he got weird. But what did familiars do? So clearly both witches and cunning folk had familiars. But what did they do? What was their gig?
So familiars had a big job, and their main gig was to watch the witches' back and make sure that they stayed safe while they were learning to practice their magical mojo. So their main job was really protection, like, we think of like psychic hits and like punches being thrown. Like they're the ones that are really taking that on for the witch, that sort of thing. So now fast forward to the 20th century and things get a little bit more modern. Some folks who dabble in magic like Wiccans started bringing familiars back into the scene, and they dug the whole old school magic vibe. Nowadays, they might use their pets or even imagine invisible familiars helping them out with their magical shenanigans. And you can find this a lot. There's a lot of modern day witchcraft practitioners or tarot readers that get, it's back to the pet telepathy thing that we talked about a couple episodes ago, where they get information from their snakes, their cats, and that sort of thing, and to help them, guide their intuition a little bit. A lot of people send their animals out to gather information and come back, which is interesting as well. So there's a rich history of, there's a rich culture of familiars in modern day witchcraft as well. Nowadays, they might even use invisible familiars to help them out with their magical shenanigans. It's like they're keeping the familiar spirit alive, but in a more contemporary way.
Super interesting. Yeah, I feel like I've only ever seen it in reference to animals. There has to be a physical form of some kind. But I think, we're gonna see how when they get a familiar, how it can kind of be anything. Because you mentioned there were people. It could just be a little spirit bud.
Yeah, exactly. And I think another accurate comparison would be how people interact with deities nowadays, where it's sometimes the deities present a physical form or do something physical, but a lot of times it's just more in tune with their spiritual practice. Anyways, it was interesting to read about modern day, but we'll go back to the old days of yore.
Okay, rewind.
So back in the good old days of early modern Britain, They were basically 3 ways people said that they met their familiars. The first one's pretty wild. They'd just be going on about their day, minding their own business, and whether they were chilling at home or wandering outdoors, bam, their familiar would just pop up out of nowhere. But the funny thing is, literally, like you said, all of this information about familiars and our concept of familiars today comes from the witch trials. And we know now that this information is like totally bunk. You know, any of the accused witches likely were not witches and, you know, were persecuted for other reasons. And the witch trials were just an excuse to act on sexism, racism, personal grudges, literally anything at the time. And that's kind of a bummer to hear, but it's what forms our modern day opinion of familiars.
Yeah, I would love to find out if there are, maybe they're like hidden somewhere in the recesses of an online library that require, I don't know, money to unlock, like if there are any like records of familiars, because I always, when I see that things came out during a trial, especially during a time when there weren't a lot of restrictions around what you could do to interrogate a person before a trial, there's a lot of like confessions of distress that can happen. So it wouldn't be surprising if some of these women maybe were forced to like misconstrue familiars. Like maybe familiars are a thing, but maybe they, you know, aren't in league with the devil, or they don't do certain things. Or maybe they like, yeah, it's one of those things where like, okay, well, how much of this was like you confessed out of distress to like lessen the charges?
Well, 100% of it is. And your point is true. Like, if we step outside of European folklore, then there's lots of things that maybe we don't call familiars, but are the same definition of familiars in other cultures.
Interesting.
But that takes that. There's just the definition of familiars. It's like when you get into pet telepathy, animal communication, and that sort of thing. The spectrum is broad. And
Gotcha.
So when we focus solely on European folklore, this is what we have. But if we were to broaden it into Wiccan or pagan, you know, beliefs and that sort of thing, then you would find more things that aren't necessarily labeled familiars, but are basically the same thing.
Gotcha.
And probably aren't rooted in witch trials.
Yeah, I think that's what is always upsetting. When you're like, oh, it's during a trial when distress is often used to get the confession that you want.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not true. It's not true witchcraft. It's just
not true.
distress.
It's distress.
And so that's also likely why our modern idea of familiars includes cats and dogs rather than snakes, bats, or humans. It wasn't like these accused witches could rope their pet rat into the equation because people only had cats and dogs as pets and rats were not pets. They were, you know, very bad. For example, accused witches of the Transvaal Lowveld in the 1930s South Africa were associated with a number of animal familiars, ranging from hippos, crocodiles, leopards, and elephants.
1930s?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay, yeah. This feels like a different episode that might be darker and I don't want to go down. It's upsetting to know that there's witch trials that have happened in the 1900s at all.
Yeah, isn't that insane? And I mean, especially South Africa, that would be a depressing episode. When I heard about it, I was like, oh, sick, witches in South Africa. That sounds like dope. And then you hear about how kind of their culture ended, and it's like, oh, this really sucks, actually. And it's kind of a bummer. But it would be an interesting episode to dive into.
Witch trials. So upsetting.
I know, but it's crazy.
But yeah, it makes sense that familiars are probably going to take the shape of something that you are culturally familiar with. Not to make a pun on it. But yeah, so that way, like, of course, something in South Africa they'd have access, quote unquote, access to hippos and crocodiles, whereas people in Europe do not. And so, of course, they're going to have cats and dogs and maybe a bird instead.
Now, the second way that familiars rolled into the lives of magical folks in Britain was kind of like a hand-me-down magical buddy. Someone else, like a family member or even a super powerful spirit, would be the one passing them along, which is so fun. I like that.
That's cute.
If you check out the story of accused witch Margaret Lay from Liverpool in 1667, she claimed that when her mother passed away, she got her familiar spirit as an inheritance, sort of like a supernatural family heirloom, which is insane to me. Like, it's a witch trial, So she's saying that she got it as a hand-me-down. What is interesting to me in witch trials is how people would loop in other members of their family into being accused witches as well. It's just interesting. It really speaks to the degree of torture that they were under.
I don't want to make assumptions about the degree of torture, but yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I think there was a family that was accused together. There was like a group of 3, or like a mother and 2 daughters, and the mother died on the way to the trial.
Oh.
Right? Geez, what was that like that you died on the way to the trial? Like you hadn't even made it there yet. And then the other 2 daughters were accused of being witches. It was a whole family thing. Basically, also, like, women living alone was dicey.
Yes, truly
People get
insane.
nervous.
People do get nervous, man. So then there's Joan Wilmot from Leicestershire.
Oh, I don't know how to pronounce that one.
We're just going to roll with it. Back in 1618, she had this mysterious master figure in her life, and this dude told her to open her mouth so he could blow in a fairy that would do her some good. And you won't believe it, but she did it, and poof, a spirit in the shape of a woman popped out. It's like something out of a fantastical bedtime story.
Well, we are talking about magic, so it should be magical. Though I'm struggling to see this as a literal action and not a euphemism, but that is just what my messed up brain. It's like, I'm not gonna, if someone was like, let me blow a fairy in your mouth, I'd be like, I don't know. No.
Yeah,
there's got to be another way.
Definitely not in the era of COVID.
No, definitely not.
In some of these stories, the cunning person or witch was really going through a rough patch before their familiar showed up on the scene. Life was throwing all sorts of problems their way, like not having enough food or cash, dealing with loss, sickness, or losing their job, you name it. So these familiars weren't just there for the heck of it. They saw these folks struggling to survive, and they thought, hey, we can help out with some magic, and it was like a lifeline they threw to folks, giving them special powers to tackle their everyday problems.
No, that's
yes.
nice.
And I think what's funny about these first English witch trials is that the accused often smash together reality and make-believe. Like, we can see it here with how these familiars are solving their very ordinary problems. We can also see it in how closely some of these first accounts closely mimic fairy lore, which was very, very, very popular at the time. One historian, Emma Wilby, really figured out that there were some pretty obvious similarities. Both familiars and fairies could shapeshift, turning into regular animals, mythical creatures, or even humans. And they could be good, bad, or just somewhere in between. Some would work with humans, while others might try to boss them around. And their names were also a bit too much of a coincidence. Familiars with the name like Tom Twit, Vinegar Tom, and Thomas a Fairy were often pretty darn close to fairies with names like Tom Reed, Tom Tumbler, Tom Tomb, and Tom Tit-Tot.
There's a lot of Toms. I'm wondering if it's all just the same fairy, just constantly renaming himself every generation.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Same goes for familiars with names like Willet, when there's also the will-o'-wisp fairies around. And don't even get me started on the familiars named Great or Little Browning, with fairies known as Browning. It's like they were borrowing each other's name tags at a costume party.
Yeah, they're like, I'll be you today. I mean, it tracks. Like, it takes a long time for a culture or belief system to, like, fully die out. So before Christianity, most European and Scandinavian indigenous groups were some form of, like, pagan, and they practiced magic. They had we're all very familiar with at least the stereotype of, like, Ireland and the leprechauns. Like, we've all heard some reduced version of this because they actually did have, like, especially with, like, the Celts and the Druids that worship nature, like, they actually did do that. But, like, once again, the dominant, like, system comes in. Sometimes they merge with local customs, like we've discussed. Like, sometimes they're really nice about it. Nice in quotes, but nice about it, where they, like, merge the gods, like we've seen in ancient Egypt when gods and the Greeks and the Romans were all, like, being merged together into, like, whoever was the dominant sphere with syncretism. Sometimes they do it with holidays, too. You know, that's like, oh, we'll let the population keep this holiday, but we'll tack on a Christian saint. So, you know, everybody's happy. Like, we won't get an uprising. But it'll still kind of be Christian now. Or, you go the other route and they just like straight up murder people who don't convert or assimilate. So either way, like marginalized folks get really creative with ways to pass down their beliefs, whether that's through fairy tales and stories or by trying to adapt their practices to seem helpful to the dominant system. After learning about cunning folk, like my personal hypothesis is that, yes, these people were Christian, but it took a while before Christianity became what we know it as. And so there's a lot of Christian mysticism that came before modern Christianity. And that's where people were merging these esoteric belief systems with Christianity before that was mostly stamped out.
Right. And it's also Christianity was politicized even
so much.
If your
it was
king
used to
is
justify.
Protestant or
Yes.
whatever, like the people of that country are considered Protestants as well.
Oh, yeah. I think when I was reading it, like, once again, we could totally do an episode just on witch trials because there's like the Witchcraft Act, which, depending on which king or queen was in power and what type of Christian they were, Protestant versus Catholic, that act would change depending on,
Right.
to be more or less harsh on things like divination, familiars and magic. And it was really weird to see the flip-flop back and forth. You're like, well, this queen was in power, so she was kind of chill with the magic, so she took this part out of the act, but this king came into power and he was not chill with it because he was this. Yeah. So wild.
Yeah, we talk about the Witchcraft Act here in a second. It's like the funniest part of it all because it's true. It was really dependent on who was in power at the time, who was around, and like, their local government to an extent as well, and how, strict they were with the rules is crazy.
A lot of whiplash.
Yeah, truly. So magicians would go all out with rituals to summon these familiars, and then get this, they trap them in bottles, rings, or even stones. It's like they wanted to keep them handy for future magic missions. It's like on-the-go magic.
Oh,
I know. It reminds me of like Genie in a bottle or something.
it kind of does. Yeah, this feels like I don't like magicians who do these. Like the familiars who come about because people want help, I'm down with, but like magicians trying to trap familiars,
Yeah.
not my vibe.
Yeah, for sure. Not about it. Let them free roam. And here's the kicker. Sometimes they'd sell these familiars as charms. Like you could buy one and they'd promise it would bring you success in gambling, love, business, you name it. They had a familiar for it. And guess what? This was all technically above board. Back in 1604, like you said, the Witchcraft Act, but it only had a problem with evil and wicked spirits. So if your familiar was on the nice side, you were in the clear.
I mean, like, I'm super curious. First of all, I'm here for free range familiars all the way. That's what I'm here for. But also, like, how would you know if a familiar was good or evil? Because my guess is, like, when they go to these trials, it's just the human, talking on behalf of like, no, I'm good. Like, no one at the trial, like the judge, is meeting your familiar. And so, like, for me, this is starting to feel like a popularity contest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, Ruth, we hate Barbara and their little dog. So we can just say she's casting bad magic and that little dog is a bad familiar and she's a witch. And
that's exactly how it goes.
That's what it feels. It feels like high school, but like with murderous consequences.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny, like, one familiar that was very famous, there were famous familiars that would come out during this time that were not associated with witch trials. Oh. And one of the kings of something or other, I want to say England. Let me look this up real quick.
Oh, is this the poodle that was considered a...
Yes, the poodle that was like in...
His name was...
Prince Rupert's dog.
Yes.
During the English Civil War, Prince Rupert would take his poodle named Boy into battle with him. And throughout the war, the dog would get after all the other guys. And so much so that everybody was scared of him, and he was credited with supernatural powers. And so then throughout the, history, throughout the whole dealio, he became considered to be a familiar. And at the end of the war, the dog was shot allegedly with a silver bullet.
That makes me sad.
It is sad.
Shot him, but yeah.
Silver bullet, werewolf.
There we go. Yeah, I was gonna say, like, once again, if the magic helps the dominant system.
Right, I know.
But I'm also just trying to imagine a war poodle, because it was documented as a poodle. As like this big war poodle. And I was just trying to imagine like Daisy.
I
as,
know,
like,
right?
With like a little like vest or something.
She would be so bad in war.
She would. She'd run away. She'd run around. Maybe she'd think everyone's a friend.
Exactly. She'd
it
be
wouldn't
playing.
go well.
Yeah, it's so funny, but it just speaks to like, how do you know if a familiar is good or evil? I guess it depends on society's view of its owner.
Pretty much. That's pretty much what it depended on. if people liked you.
Right. So things got even weirder with the witch's mark. This mark had do you know what a witch's mark is?
I didn't know exactly what it was, but I've heard of it, and then I looked it up.
Yeah. So it's like a birthmark. It's literally any sort of mark on your body
anything people didn't think was normal.
Yeah, it's basically just an excuse for people to like sexually harass these accused witches.
Oh.
It's very sad.
Yeah.
So this mark kind of had a saucy twist to it, and it often showed up in trial records as evidence against folks being accused as witches. So what's this mark all about? Well, picture this. It's usually an extra teat, like an extra bump somewhere on the body.
Like an extra nipple. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Extra nipple. And get this, people thought witches used it to let their familiars have a little sip.
Ew. Ew. I don't like the way you said that.
It's like a supernatural milkshake bar or something.
That's disgusting. I hate everything you said. Yeah, and I think part of what they wasn't like necessarily milk. I think it was also rumored that familiars would drink blood from the witch's mark. Yeah, it's a blood pact. You know, the usual.
Yeah, you know, what's mine is yours.
Yeah.
Now take the Salem witch trials in 1692 as an example. There was this lady named Anne Putnam, and she straight up told Martha Corey that she saw a yellow bird suckling between her fingers. Talk about a weird accusation, right?
This is really just something that, once again, I just think Anne doesn't like Martha.
No.
Or something. Yeah, it's just like Anne and Martha aren't buds. And guess what? We've got a real easy way to get rid of Martha. Just like...
Yeah.
I
feel like the witch trials, Salem witch trials, are my Roman Empire.
Oh, yeah. It's like, yeah, how often do you think about the witch trials?
Every day.
All the time. All the time.
So in the world of modern witchcraft, forget thinking about animals as these evil demon creatures. That's ancient history. Thank God. But here's the interesting bit. Many modern witches are all about connecting with animals in their magical practices. They're into animals for their natural instincts and psychic powers, which help them connect with nature and the gods. It's like tapping into some ancient wisdom with a modern twist.
Yeah, it's like many things in this modern age where we have access to all sorts of information and research. Familiars are going to be different to different people, depending on what they practice and, you know, their deities and all that jazz. So some believe that an animal who's unexpectedly drawn to you may have chosen you and is psychically connecting with you. Others simply try to form stronger bonds with pets that they already take care of. And others may just ask the universe or their deities to send a familiar to them.
Modern practices have also moved pretty far away from familiars using an animal-only form. Folks call them low familiars. So here's a cool historical example. John Dee, an English magician, was all about his scrying crystal. And we've talked about scrying. It's just peering into something and gaining insight and all that. He believed that it was home to a smart spirit that he and his buddy Edward Kelly used to chat with folks on the other side. You know, beyond the regular world. Back to free range spirits.
I know,
let these familiars be free range. So let's have them the same rights as chickens.
Yeah, they can just come and visit whenever they feel like it.
Yeah. Then there are these other familiars called high familiars, and these little shapeshifters can turn into whatever a person needs at the moment. Need an animal buddy? They got it. Want a person-shaped companion? No problem. They're like magical shapeshifters ready to assist however you want. So whether you view them as historical relics or modern-day companions, the concept of familiars remains a testament to the enduring human fascination with the mysterious and the magical.
Okay, but now for the real question at the end of the episode, Ruth. After learning about both pet psychics and familiars, is your dog your familiar? Are you going to try and connect?
I don't think my dog is my familiar.
Oh, no. Like, no, it's just, yeah, we're just friends.
Daisy only cares about swimming. And I don't
Swimming
think
and-
there's any other thoughts that go through her brain. She just wants to go in the river and swim, and that's all she cares about in life.
That's very sweet.
And I love that for her. But I don't think she would, like, go out of her way to help me in any form, especially when the river is just a few feet away.
She was like, but the river, I know you're having a hard time, Mom, but if we all take a swim, maybe that's what she's trying to tell you, Ruth. Maybe if you
Right.
go take a swim, she'll chill.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know. Maybe that's
And
what she's
also
trying to tell you.
there's just the idea of, like, familiars, you know, taking the hits for the witches. Where
I
I'm like,
know.
I can do that myself. I don't want to bring
Right.
my dog into that.
Yeah, I don't know how many people nowadays use familiars as like a defense mechanism. Like they're not like a shield.
I don't think so. I think probably it's more of like telepathic communication and, you know, insights and that sort of thing.
It does feel like there's a lot more like autonomy for the animal nowadays, which is
Yeah,
nice.
for sure. I think
Yeah.
we've definitely evolved past that, and that's good to go. Do you think biscuits?
Why not? I wouldn't hate it. I don't, once again, no psychic hits, but there's definitely times when she's like, it's time to go to bed. Like,
Yeah.
she's like, hey, you've been sitting too long. We should play. And she'll like bring the string toy in. I'm like, you're right, Biscuits. We both need to get up.
Right? That's so true. Well, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. If you're a fan of the podcast, we need you to do this so we can find new fans. We should really
Should we
lessen
rewrite
that language. That's
We
pretty
need
harsh.
you. I mean, if you make it a joke, we could probably keep it in.
Right?
Yeah, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. We'd like to find other fans, so
Yeah.
like that's how this thing works.
Share this with somebody you think would be interested in learning about familiars.
Yeah, exactly. That's all.
Tell your friends, follow us on all socials. Our handles are Sweet Death Inc. and Mystic Fool Tarot on all platforms. See you later.
I think you keep that whole section in.
Oh, absolutely.
I think we were like, wow, this language is a little rough.
I think so too.